Hello, thank you for joining the final session of the 2021 Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar online. My name is David Holland and I'm the Director of Public Policy at WestAF. I'm an African-American male with brown skin and a clean-shaven head and face. I am wearing a blue shirt. Behind me, you'll see a completely white. First, a few housekeeping items. All mics will be muted and cameras off for the duration of the session. If you have a question, please write it using the questions feature by clicking on Live Now and then Questions. You'll see a question mark to the left. On the left-hand navigation, you'll also see Ask a Question. Please ask questions as they come up for you. The last 20 minutes or so of this session will be devoted to a Q&A moderated by colleagues of mine from WestAF's policy cohort. If you'd like to share something about ALIS, use hashtag ALAS2021, that's hashtag ALIS2021 for all your social media posts and communications throughout the event. Now, a land acknowledgement, a practice that we use to introduce WestAF convenings. So with respect, I'd like to acknowledge that the lands we occupy today are the traditional homelands of a number of indigenous nations and peoples. We recognize that we are talking in an online space, but that the places we are physically residing in what is now the Western region and across the United States, are also current and ancestral lands where diverse indigenous communities have lived and healed. We recognize these indigenous nations as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homeland are renewed and reaffirmed. We recognize Native and Indigenous peoples are an integral part of our community, resilient in responding to and healing from a legacy of violence, displacement, and migration. We also recognize the resilient nations that remain an integral part of our communities. With this truth spoken, we hope to build mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference, and share our gratitude for the Native American, Indigenous, Alaska Native, and Pacific Islander communities that lead and form, partner with, and support the WestAF. Humbly, we commit to continue learning from our Indigenous leaders. Thank you. So now I will briefly introduce our panelists. You have access to all of their bios using our speakers tab, but in summary, here goes. Cezanne Charles is a designer, curator, policy strategist, and researcher with 20 years of experience of creative industries leadership in both the US and the UK. Cezanne is noted for her futures-oriented approach to shape transformational conversations about the future of the creative sector. Cezanne is co-founder of Root of Two, a research and practice-driven hybrid design studio whose goal is to create a condition where we can perceive ourselves, the here and now, and the future differently, using humor, play, interaction, and participation to undermine and reframe systems, infrastructures, and networks. Cezanne formerly served as Director of Creative Industries at Creative Mini Michigan and Executive Director of New Media Scotland. Many acknowledge Jen Cole as one of the most imaginative arts policy thinkers nationally at this time. Jen currently serves as the Chief of Staff of the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts at Arizona State University and the Director of its National Accelerator for Innovation. Through this work, Jen seeks to identify, invest in, prototype, and scale practices and policies that center artists and designers as co-creators of social change in justice, health, and sustainability. Jen formerly served as a local arts agency leader and has been a national leader in service volunteerism and environmental issues with Points of Light and Earth Force. Abdiel serves as the program officer for Ambitious at the Center for Cultural Innovation. Through this initiative, Abdiel leads CCI's investments in the alternative economic lines of and federated infrastructure by those most dispossessed, primarily BIPOC communities, who are seeking financial self-determination in order to preserve and support their cultural identity and artistic expressions on their own terms. Abdiel is also a researcher, curator with research interests related to social movements, particularly immigrant youth activism. Thanks, Cezanne, Jen, and Abdiel for joining us for today's conversation on reimagining the field, rather, and driving for systems change nationally. I'll pose my first question in moments, and I ask that when you first speak, you state your name, preferred pronouns, describe your appearance and location. So I'm going to pose my question and then call on one of you. So in our framing conversation, I know we spoke a lot about what we've inherited and what to create in terms of the models that exist in our field and across our economy and society as a whole. So I would like to start by having you all speak to that. How would you describe the model that we have inherited, and how would you describe the types of models we need to create in this moment? I will begin with Cezanne.
Hi everyone, my name is Cezanne Charles. I am an African-American woman. I have black glasses that are slightly angular on my face. I have natural shoulder length hair, and it is a mixture of salt and pepper gray at this current moment. Much like my outfit, which is a black shirt and a gray cardigan. And in the background, you can see 2 bookshelves and a projector, which I never know when I'll be called to project new media art on a building at any moment. I am on the current, past, and present homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples, particularly those of the Three Fires Confederacy. So I would like to take a moment to just acknowledge the Anishinaabe peoples of Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Dawa people. And my preferred pronouns are she, her. So in order to really think about the kind of systems that we've inherited in the past, I tend to say that they were systems that were never designed for us to fully sort of occupy the spaces and expanses of all of humanity. And if you sort of acknowledge from the get-go that that is the legacy of both the kind of policy, political, infrastructure, social contracts that we have at play, we have a system where we have always had aspirational, maybe language that sort of occupies the collective imaginary that we all are living and working within. But then in practice, we've always had this sort of system that has been both, on the one hand, exquisitely designed to sort of disempower and disengage and disenfranchise folks, and at the same time sort of promote a narrative where one can only rise through bootstrapism. And I think that those twin forces of always having to like reach for the aspirational, be told that the system's broken, and that the only way that you can succeed is through a kind of rugged individualistic determinism, is kind of counter to, I think, really what we think of when we think about the kind of collective movements of both care and resilience that have actually helped us sort of occupy our full bodies and our full selves in an economy, in a culture, in a place that hasn't been built for us. So I think we're always kind of with those dynamics of what the promise is of sort of what we collectively imagine the construct of America to be, and then the way that, particularly if you are in the cultural or creative industries, your real sort of fabric of making is a constant weaving and repairing of that fabric. And I think that that's kind of what we find ourselves grappling with today.
Great. All right. Thanks, Cezanne, for introducing that and framing for us some of the inherent tensions and dynamics in our American society and the narratives that we have framed to describe the system that we actually all exist within. So I'm going to next invite Abdiel to speak to my point about what models have we inherited and what models may we want to create or do we need to create in this moment.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Abdiel Lopez. My pronouns are they, them. I am the program officer at Ambitious, or for Ambitious, at the Center for Cultural Innovation that is headquartered in what we know as LA, but are the lands of the Tongva, Chumash, and Kish people. So Ambitious is in an interesting location. We oftentimes refer Ambitious to be a sort of experimental arm of the philanthropic sector. Through that sort of lens, we understand that we inherited old or more so conventional grant-making practices or models in philanthropy that have, while inherently were structured to do good, have unfortunately caused unintentional harm. So through our initiative, we're looking at the paradigms that have shaped the conditions that place arts workers, creatives, cultural bearers in precarious situations. By looking at those conditions, we also then start to dig deep into how to solve these mechanisms that are at play, whether subtly or explicitly, both economically but also culturally. So we really do pride ourselves in looking at the cultural sort of lens of economic models, because we do understand that cultural change begets political, economic, and social change. So by looking at how, for example, the investees are transforming inherited financial models, such as, for example, the discriminatory 5 C's of credit as one example, they are also promoting this idea that we want to be financially self-determining. My community members want to be financially self-determining. So we actually understand fundamentally that this system has never worked for us because it has supported just a certain group or certain profile of people, and we are not included in that. So in order to not only diversify, but to actually have a seat at the table and a piece of the pie, if you will, we need to completely transform the way the economy works so that we can begin to own assets. And by owning assets, I was going to say ownership of assets, by owning assets, you're also basically reclaiming the power of your narrative, of your community, of your heritage. And that is why we look at the economic model that then promotes cultural sovereignty, specifically for BIPOC communities. So that's just one example that we understand how we've inherited these models and what we're doing through our investment portfolio to more robustly support sometimes these nascent efforts or these efforts that have been overlooked by conventional grant-making practices because they fall outside of the scope of conventional grant-making eligibility requirements, such as nonprofits. Many of these efforts are at the helm of experimenting with, for example, shared ownership models, like cooperativism, like collectivism, like mutual aid efforts. So we want to, as the eyes and the ears of our pooled funders, we want to understand what the needs are, what the capital needs are. And by thinking of capital, we think of capital in a way that goes beyond the financial dollar. What does technical assistance looks like for cooperatives that are working in BIPOC communities that want to own land? What does working with a cooperative friendly lender look like when we also provide the loan guarantee, for example? And I'm thinking of one specific example, which is the open application that we launched last year, where we teamed up with Optima Entrepreneur Cooperative and Seed Commons to provide robust and integrated capital support for these cooperatives. So there's a lot here to explore, discover, and uncover and unpack. And through our investments, we're hoping to push and shift the needle within philanthropy and within foundations to actually improve the conditions that maybe we have unintentionally also had a hand in creating.
Wonderful. Thank you for describing how Ambitious is building and supporting the new models that we need to see in this moment. I'm going to bring you into the conversation Jen now, and also as we continue this line with the group, I know when we spoke in our framing conversation, there was the notion that we inherit a system that centers institutions, and we need to move a system that centers humans, artists, and creative workers. And obviously, in the conversation so far, we've heard about the growing importance in this moment, and for many years and decades, of cooperatives, of collectivism, mutual aid societies, and various other constructs that may be part of the models that we need to be more supportive of as well, other than traditionally structured institutions like 501c3s and other types of institutions. So Jen, your thoughts on all of this?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Cole. I am a middle-aged Caucasian woman with very short hair and an electric yellow sweater, coming to you from the ceded and unceded homelands of the Acapulco, O'odham, Maricopa, and Peepash peoples, sometimes also known as Tempe, Arizona. And I also have a lot of green paint in the background. There's a lot of colors going on. So I think what I would add to what Cezanne and Abdiel have sort of already framed is around sort of two kind of notions that I think we have to understand and acknowledge our sector has been structured around and imagine different. So one is, again, this notion that both of them have spoken about, you know, the cultural sector, as known in America, kind of came from a patron class, right? We built institutions to support the transactional exchange of somebody producing labor for the benefit and entertainment of someone else, and then we commodified it, right? That's just real simple. And in that, the structures of philanthropy, investment, and public policy kind of all go up around that sort of larger idea that there's a transactional exchange, but the person actually producing the labor isn't actually benefiting. And so one of the things I would throw out is sort of what would happen if we constructed our policies, practices, and investment tools, to Cezanne and Abdiel's point, around the idea that the product isn't as important as the person, and that sort of in creating a healthy, connected, socially, economically successful, success being a kind of other problematic word, vibrant person, that we actually then have a full life and a full health and community. So there's this sort of symbiotic relationship between a healthy person and a healthy community, right? So sort of, I think it's completely possible for us to, even in big state-run institutions, for us to begin to pivot and reimagine that as a center versus a product of some point, a play, a show, a thing that's very temporal in nature versus the people building and creating that, right? So I think that's one question I would pose. And the other question is, that goes along with that and is sort of implied, but I think we should push at it, is the idea that the sector must live in many places. So culture lives in all aspects of our life. So culture doesn't live in one silo here, but we imagine, and we often talk about the cultural sector as a silo, a monolith. The reality is we have to sort of disassemble that, because in reality, and particularly in traditional and indigenous cultures, it's always been disassembled, right? Like, it is part of your everyday living and being. And so our policies and our practices and our investments push us into this transactional space, when in fact we should be working in and living in this much more sort of dispersed set of what we understand a sector to be. So I would sort of say that it's very possible for us to put people at the center of thinking about our work going forward. And it's even possible for big institutions, right, to begin to like reframe some of their tropes towards that end. And it's also really possible to stop thinking just about reinforcing a monolith, but really pushing at those who are also invested in culture, in health, in justice, in sustainability, as allied partners in a dispersed sector. It also means the disbursement of power, right? Like, and both of those things mean we have to fundamentally readdress who holds power, what the power is, and the idea that maybe a more powerful, beautiful, cultural sector is actually one that is disassembled, right? Both with where the power rests with people, but where it's also sort of not seen as sort of these imperial, monoliths. So I think we need to begin to think about the cultural sector as really a community sector, and begin to sort of frame it that way.
Wonderful. You all have taken us, even in this short time, in so many different directions, and I know that this will be so insightful for the people who are participating in this session. I want to draw out this discussion of power and who holds power, and also relatedly about leadership, because I know that that's something that we talked about in the session. So I suppose my question would be, who holds power in this system? Who holds power not necessarily see or be as visible? And what is the role of leaders in the creative sector, particularly in this moment, but as we look to a future in which we have a reimagined field? So, Abdiel.
That's an interesting question. And what prompted, or what that prompted in me is thinking about the fact that, for example, in philanthropy, at least in Ambitious, we have the ability to, again, like I said, be the eyes and the ears of the pool funders. So we actually actively listen to where the movement is already happening, because we recognize that the leadership is already, it's on the ground. They're, again, like I said, they're at the helm of experimenting and ushering new worlds through their economic models, through different efforts that have fallen outside of the scope of convention. So I would say, I mean, just from the get-go, the leadership really exists on the ground, but it's up to those that are working within institutions to react, not just react, but sustainably start to build that infrastructure that will help build the larger movement, and that's also sustainable. So I think it's an interesting question, and it's very dynamic, and it has a lot of different veins, but I really want to push for this idea that the leadership is already happening. It's just up to us to listen and to actually move everything, move our assets. And foundations can do this too. They have, endowments, and they have PRIs, so they can more robustly support these efforts. It's about really deconstructing and dismantling the status quo and being okay with doing so. It's hard, it's not easy, but this is why we have to start doing even just the most minute, seemingly minute practices, like, for example, not requiring grantees to be, or not extracting from grantees when they're doing final reporting, having conversations on the ground. If you're inviting people to propose something for your funding, maybe have them take an excerpt or proposal from another funder to yours, and you can just, because this is what we do in Ambitious, is we take these proposals and we craft a narrative that works for Ambitious, the board, etc. So to not replicate extraction. And that really is at the core root of Ambitious, is how do we not replicate those systems that we're trying to alter, dismantle, and transform. So it really is being in tune with the people and making sure that we can also adequately move these resources in a way that amplifies and just scales those movements across or upwards.
So I think, this is Cezanne. So I think one of the things that's very interesting about the question of power is, we just heard an example where people who we would traditionally think of as having power have actively engaged in a form of ceding power, reducing the barriers of gatekeeping. And then the question becomes, how do we begin to make that the norm and the normative practices across all of the ways that we think about sort of giving and remunerating and supporting and empowering, whether it's grantees in our sector or even those who are looking at kind of models to just not even participate in the sort of culture of grantee and grant making, right? And I think that that's one of the kind of big questions about, like, what is the business model of culture going forward? What is the economic basis for how culture moves forward? How does that reflect what Jen was just saying as well about the idea of decentralization? And I think where it leads me to is this idea that what we can be borrowing and actively adapting is the way that we practice kind of leaderful institutions as well as leaderful movements. So instead of thinking about the classic kind of hierarchy, even within our cultural institutions, where are we showing up and supporting shared leadership? Where are we, showing up and not just having the usual conversations about diversifying boards, but really actually thinking about what is a board for? Right? Like, I don't want to just sort of promote the idea that all we really have to do is sort of have a certain kind of representation within systems when the systems themselves need to be reimagined, both from the inside out and outside in. And so some of the things that I take energy from are things like the Transforming Power Fund, that is a similar movement coming out of Detroit that's really looking at, like, how do you actually do grant making that is really from the point of view of a community board. Who are actually highlighting and acknowledging folks who need sort of funds and resources. I'm really interested in the models where, in order to deal with the precarity that often exists in grant making systems, we're thinking about what is the gen ops for artists? And then how do we go even further and think, like, what is like the W-2 income for artists? Like, and then I think that there are things like, what is the way of acknowledging the sort of transitions that have to happen within kind of existing sort of fabric of 501c3s. We can't de-invent all of us tomorrow who have worked in 501c3s. So we have to kind of deal with that infrastructure where it's at. And I think some of the things that you see coming out of Art Change US, the Cultural New Deal, certainly the Cultural Community Benefits Toolkit are all about this kind of adaptive transition and transformation that acknowledges where we've been, tries to sort of be empathetic about where we are, but still holds us accountable for the fact that it's just simply not good enough and time's up and we need to do other things. So I think for me, it's always this negotiation about who has power over versus who has power with. And I think in general, we should be moving in ways that seeks to sort of establish the power with rather than over.
Yeah, this is Jen. I'd like to just pick up on one of the points that Cezanne's really talking about, the power with piece. And a lot of my work has been done in the public sector, so in local governments and state governments and at the federal level. And one of the things that some research that I've been involved in recently really kind of validates something that we all kind of live and breathe and know, is that there is an existing set of leaders, particularly in middle management in the public sector, many of whom are BIPOC, many of whom are BIPOC women, that are already there and are leading and doing exactly the work that Cezanne is talking about, right? They are sort of sharing power, they are bringing in community collaborators, they are holding space for innovation and risk-taking, moving resources in different ways that are normally constructed, right? And the reality is, I think simultaneous to moving power completely grassroots, like Abdiel is talking about, I think we also have to understand that system change is quite slow, particularly transformational change. And so what do we need to do to retain and invest in and support and buttress the humans doing that interstitial, like I call them creative catalyst class, right? They're kind of like, okay, the three of us, you're in the public works department and you're in the parks department and you're in the local or state arts agency, and we're going to kind of pool our resources and maybe do this kind of new thing and hope everybody doesn't kind of look at us askance. But they are kind of breaking that boundary and offering, moving power out, changing rules, looking at these like really complicated public processes that were constructed to keep people out. They were constructed to decenter workers. They were constructed to harm BIPOC communities, but they're slowly pulling at them, right? So the question becomes, but those people also bear a significant amount of labor with very little peer group and very little peer support. So one of the questions I would put forward is, if we really want a decentralized, if the goal is decentralized, completely people-powered, what is the interstitial medium-term space where we really can support those BIPOC leaders and women driving that kind of change space in the middle? How does philanthropy support those folks? Because there's hardly any peer development programs for those people. Who are you working with in your own community, in your own office right now that you think, oh my goodness, that person is probably going to leave my work, my sector, this place in a couple of years if we don't sort of support them. So I would sort of name out there that one of the practical things we could do is sort of ask ourselves, who are the people already doing this work inside the system? And how might we really support them, give them runway, give them permission, get out of their way, and make sure that they are professionally seen in a way that is supportive of their own humanity, right?
Wonderful. I'm glad all of these elements have come into this conversation. And there's many layers to this, and I'm glad that we unpacked at least a little bit, as much as we can do in a brief conversation, some of the power dynamics at play and how we can shift those power dynamics and support those who outside of these systems and within these systems are driving change and really transformation beyond that of the systems that we currently have in place. I want to shift our conversation in the direction that you all posed about the inherited models that we have and where we need to go, and the kind of models that we are imagining and the models that we are seeing emerge and that we want to support. And so part of that is shifting the conversation into how do we reimagine the social contract for the role of how we support artists and creative workers, and what would the system look like? What would the system look like if we actually centered the concerns of artists, creative workers, cultural workers, humans in the conversations that we are having and in the work we're doing? And any of you can kick off. If you have a burning thing that you would like to say, just go ahead. And if not, I'll call on one of you, of course. All right, I'm gonna call on Cezanne.
So I think that causes me to think about two very specific things. And I think one is a little bit harder for us to maybe get our head around, which is that if we're centering the sort of practices of artists, we have to sort of think about value first and foremost. And certainly part of that is economic value. Part of that is about rethinking our systems of validation and reward for artists, which is slightly separate but normally commingled with the idea of economic value for artists. And then I think the third thing that is potentially kind of harder and a little bit more challenging is that a lot of artists who are doing this work are wanting to show up through their creative work in other spaces. And I think it's a little bit sort of uncomfortable for our sector to sort of follow an artist, say, into the conversation around undocumented or new Americans or immigrant spaces, because where are we the expert in that conversation? And so that's another one of those points where it's like, oh, that's about power. That's about sort of a power and privilege and prestige and sort of fear of not being the expert at the table, right? And increasingly, when I think about artists who are working on land back movements or thinking about environmental work, or trying to think about increasingly, like, how do we sort of not reimagine the idea of the criminal justice system, but how do we reimagine what it actually means to sort of deal with, like, the community spaces we need to build. So we're actually talking about a preventative thing. We're talking about what should have been a justice contract with BIPOC people to begin with. Like, that is uncomfortable, because the question is, what are the aesthetics of that space? Where does our expertise show up in that space? How do we get to own that conversation in the arts, right? And I think that's what's both interesting and daring and challenging about going where artists go. It's not just that they're questioning the business models in our own field, they're fundamentally questioning the models of what is right and just in society. And for us, that means we have to grapple with a new set of aesthetics, a new set of language, a language that we are not fluent in the arts. And I think that doesn't mean that we don't bring our own language to those conversations alongside and in solidarity with those artists. But I think that in some cases is more uncomfortable than the idea of just paying art as well. I think, the conversations I have where people really start going, ooh, is when it's like, wait a minute, like this is fundamentally not in my territory of expertise. We're not actually talking about skills and craft. We're talking about ideas that are disruptive and challenging and powerful. And where do I sit at that table as an arts leader who's maybe built a vertical career in terms of thinking about my own hierarchy, my own prestige, my own sort of comfort level. So I think those are the things that I think about. I think that there are real challenges on the economic front, but I think the ideological space is almost in some cases the scarier space for people to enter into.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot because, a lot about working with artists in these translational spaces, right? Like we were talking on our earlier call that, like, I don't know a single cultural worker who also isn't a movement leader or a neighborhood watch for a neighborhood person or a school board person or a parent, or like people live in multiple systems, right? They function and lead in multiple systems. And I think often at our college we're trying to sort of like, we train people very well to be good at their craft, right? If you formally come through a formal artist training program, we train you to be really good at your craft. But at the same time, like we can, and I'm using the royal we, not just the university, the formal and informal systems, like how do we help artists lean into those sort of policy areas, practice areas that might not be aligned with their training, but that they have passion about, and sort of how do we do that? Because I think at the end of the day, for us to have this flat system, for us to sort of really see money move and power move into all the places we want artists to access it, there needs to be some support mechanisms for artists who want to adapt those skills, right? So for artists who want to be able to sort of to learn that translational space with some safety, right? That it's not going to harm them again, right? So whether that's training programs for themselves, whether it's peer-to-peer work, there is so much of that already happening, right? There's so much of that exists already within solidarity movements and movements around the country. But I think it's lifting that up and creating space for that time so that artists also feel successful in that complicated work and acknowledged in that complicated work. So I think we all are working with artists who do that work all the time. It's very invisibilized in publics. It's very invisibilized in resource allocation. It's very, very, very invisibilized in professionalism and professional-based standards. Sort of people who know how to do that work well are understood as a ceramicist, but not just a ceramicist. So I think that we have to do some things as a sector to imagine what skills, imagine what we want. What does a professional sector look like that supports workers in community health? That's very different than the professional sector we started our century with, right? And so we have to imagine new ways of formally and informally acknowledging that and lifting up that kind of held knowledge in a really thoughtful way, both with money and with power. So I think that whole professional arc is a whole big one. That's a whole other conversation that's complicated, but really important. Like, we can't keep training and supporting people formally and informally for a sector that is moving if we don't sort of simultaneously move what we understand to be sort of the professional set of skills and tools one needs to function in that.
That's great. And that brings to mind, outside of Ambitious, largely CCI supports individual artists because we were founded on this idea that we didn't see enough capital, resources, knowledge production avenues being shared with individuals. We always saw them being shared with organizations or intermediaries. So CCI was founded on that premise to move resources and unfetter artists' productivity and impact. That is literally our mission. So how do we do that through our trainings? How do we do that through our workshops, our publication of Business of Art? And that feeds into this idea with an Ambitious of trust-based philanthropy. And what I mean by that is only the people who are on the ground understand their needs. They know their needs better than we do. So we encourage them to, for example, unfetter. Well, so what we do is we unfetter the capital, the grant, by providing unrestricted capital support or general operating support. And we trust the investee to use that grant fund, however they please in order to robustly support that effort. So it really is about, again, trusting. So that's my 2 cents. Trust-based philanthropy, and also how do we unfetter productivity is by understanding that culture is not just one silo. They're across, culture exists in all parts of our life, which is why I think, and that brings to mind the recent report that was funded by the Hewlett Foundation and written by the Urban Institute that we commissioned, Arts Workers in California, that we produced last month, or that we released last month, which looks at arts workers specifically in California as a sort of springboard to then engage in a larger discourse around the idea that we need to renew the social contract for arts workers. And what does that look like? That looks like opening up the portability of benefits for independent workers, arts workers, et cetera. So when you look and when you target arts workers, you're also looking at other workers that are in similar working conditions and structures, such as undocumented immigrant workers. And by looking at those conditions, you're also solving for the conditions that a larger swath of the population is facing. So it's not just again, just repeating what I've heard here and agree with, is culture is everywhere. So if we do invest in the arts and culture sphere, we're also investing in a larger swath of the population and other spheres as well.
The only other thing I would add in that, and I think it gets really overwhelming, particularly for people working in public sector jobs, to think about, okay, well, how would I even start to do this? Because I'm like, fettered, to your Abdiel's point, those people are very fettered, right? They're very fettered by lots of things. So like, what if you can't directly fund artists right now, but you know that's the goal? You have a budget, and a budget, as Cezanne reminds us often, is a moral document. And so if you can't directly fund artists, could you contract with a nonprofit, a collective, somebody else that does directly fund artists? Like, there are things that we kind of do by rote, particularly in big institutions, that we just sort of go through the motions of them because that's how we've always done them. But if we go back and ask ourselves, what might be what are 3 things I can do right now to recenter workers, to sort of begin to move resources and power out into community? How might I do something, even if I might not have the policy construct to do it right this moment? What could I do, right? What is the next tactical step I might be able to take? So for example, I work at a very large state institution. We have similar issues with contracting, and we work in community and co-create with community in everything that we do. And there are members of our community who, because of their immigration status or because of other statuses, don't feel or cannot engage with the university in a co-creation way. So the way in which we approach that is to contract with solidarity-based groups in our community who are already working with those individuals. And when there is a need to sort of compensate people for their time and labor, we partner with, in cooperation with those who can, right? Because our institution may not be able to do that directly, so that we work in trust-based ways with community partners that are in those spaces. So I think it's contingent upon large institutions to begin to think about the tactical and immediate ways they can begin to move these things, even if the big feels like a lot, right? And it does, it needs to change fundamentally, but fundamental change happens by starting, so.
And I'll just add one thing to that. Make it a goal. I mean, that's the beauty of it. It's like, you make it a goal, but you take action on it, and then you can track it and measure it. Like, I'm very much like, if we don't sort of change what we're evaluating, what we're measuring ourselves by, what our yardstick is, whether it's wanting over the next 3 years to see a shift in how much of our budget is going to individual artists that are, BIPOC, then if that's a goal, then you can sort of really work towards that incrementally and measure that shift. But if you don't sort of acknowledge that that's a change you want to make, that's an intervention you want to make and you want to stand by, and then you want to keep taking action, bite-sized actions add up, I guess is what I'm saying. And durationally, that is how shift happens. And so I would call out, it's like everybody has some power, some way, some autonomy, some agency in the job that they have right now. that allows them to sort of move on this. And I would just say that's like really a charge for me. It's like, what can you move, right? Like we can't all deal with the big picture, which is enormous and complicated and complex, but we should be able to figure out what action we can take today, tomorrow, and then just keep putting one foot in front of the other as we do that work.
Wonderful, thank you all. So I'm gonna transition now, and I'm going to hand over to my colleagues in the policy cohort to moderate a question and answer portion of this. Janae Delaviran, our Office and Culture Coordinator at West Staff and co-leader of the policy cohort, will moderate this portion of the program. And Janae, you can join by cutting on your video and unmuting yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Thanks for everything today. This has been a great discussion. My name is Janae. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Hispanic woman with shoulder-length black hair and a little blonde streak on one side. I am wearing a very cozy, light gray, colorful sweater. Behind me, I have my little music corner with my keyboard, guitars, and bass guitar. So just a reminder to all the people watching, feel free to submit your questions if you have any last minute. The first one I'm going to ask, Cezanne, David mentioned your work encourages play, and I think we often forget how crucial that element is when connecting with one another. And Jen, you also touched on this when you said the product is not as important as the person. I think there's a humanity to the arts that we don't find as prevalent in some industries. So how do you envision injecting things like play and humanity into this work to disarm the people and the systems to bring progress and bolster the creative fields? And what do you think the benefit to this approach is? I don't know if Cezanne wants to start, or Jen, or you as well, Abdiel.
I'll unmute, and I was looking at Jen, basically going, Jen, you should like tee us up. So I would say one of the things that I think about a lot, my background is originally in performance. I've moved into doing a lot of kind of interactive public works. A lot of them sort of play on humor, and then at the heart of it, there is our sort of design research consultancy, which is really about doing, as you said, that kind of scenarios and future work. And I think one of the big things is like, you know, if we're trapped in the reality of our everyday, then that's the self we bring to this work. And quite frankly, a lot of this is about sort of disrupting the way that we normatively think. That's like a really powerful pull that sort of keeps the status quo as the status quo. And like the easiest sort of visual image that I sort of plant in people's head is this idea that most of us maybe remember what the Jetsons photograph is, right? So we've got a nuclear family in a flying car. And I think about how iconic that image is. But then if we think about all the under-imagined spaces that that image really left out, right? So we can imagine a flying car, but we couldn't imagine Jane working, let alone for equal pay. We could imagine a flying car, but we couldn't imagine building a good middle-class life in America that wasn't tied to factory work. Right? So when you think about how we prioritize and sort of gear our society towards the idea of the moonshot, the flying car, and we've left out all of these sort of banal, under-imagined spaces, the under-imagined spaces are what are really compelling and exciting and will actually move society forward, right? And so the challenge is, how do you sort of make those spaces available again for reconsideration? And I think the best way to do that is in the same way that we think about the moonshot, which is, how do we sort of make it joyous? How do we make it about abundance? How do we not make it about scarcity? And we do that when we play. We give each other those opportunities and chances when we play and when we laugh in a way that we just don't do when we're thinking about how to be efficient or how to be economical, or how we do our jobs in a more productive way. All of those things are very mean terms that are about streamlining and efficiency. And I'm like, how do we sort of break out of just even that mindset? So I think that's where our creative practice as well as our research practice really tries to engage in game and play and humor in order to do that.
Amen. And I mean, the thing I would just sort of say, and I think because almost everybody, you know, who's involved in WestF is also an investor or a funder, is to imagine in all those interstitial spaces that Cezanne just named, artists are the most creative people, and they leave so much on the shelf contorting to the things we want them to do to get resources, right? So we have a program where we just, that used to be project-based and outcomes-driven and and we would invest in, it was for BIPOC artists, and the contorting that people had to do to access a small amount of capital to then produce a work that may not have been the thing that fed them, that fed their family, that was exciting, that was like, sort of what they wanted to put into the world. This, in the last 18 months, we untethered it, right? We sort of, and it's just unrestricted support. And it's invitation-based professional support. So when someone says, I need help with, we stop and we do, right? Or I need help with. And so, you know, so we have these 4 fellows right now who one of them like never even imagined being able to apply to graduate school, but because they had invitational help, are now applying to graduate school. We have one who actually didn't complete any terminal degree, who is now, like, because they have had the unrestricted support, able to sort of think about that. Like, we have an artist who said, I have had a project sitting on a shelf for 15 years that hasn't fit into anybody's grant category. Like, the imagination and the joy that would happen in this world, and things would be created, right? They would just not be the things that we determine need to be created. They would actually be created by the people living in place who know what their community needs, who knows the stories that their community wants to hear. And I am firmly believing, I firmly believe trust-based philanthropy and sort of this modality is possible. It's impossible with all different types of investors. And I think what happens product-wise is so much more rich, so much more well-rounded, and so much more human than anything that we would ever get, even with a much bigger budget, in sort of making people sort of contort to our timelines, our budgets, our explicit outcomes categories. I mean, I think how can we free ourselves from that? Because what we actually do is free people to be their full creative selves, and they are inventing in those spaces that are not visible. They're just shelving it all the time because the artist then can't be who they authentically are in their own work.
Great, thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Abdiel, or I can move on to the next question?
Yeah, just one thing that brings to mind this leading question, or more so this guiding framework for our initiative and just overall programming, is for whom are we doing this? Rather than what are we doing, it's really, that is the principle here, is for whom. We just wanted to add that and put that on the table.
Great, thank you. So kind of, you know, continuing with the imagination, if you could craft a manifesto for reimagination, what items would be at the top of your list? It's a tough one, I know. I feel like it's on the tip of everyone's tongue.
I'm struggling with the word manifesto, but I'm going to say something quite radical. Like, what would happen if we didn't have arts funding and we just had, you know, community wellness funding? And human wellness funding. What would happen if we just, like, actually funded we funded wealth in abundance in the broadest sense of the word, right? Arts would happen. Like, arts don't happen in this world because there's a giant federal agency that provides a small amount of money. Like, arts happen because people are human, right? So so that would be my manifesto, which is like, what if we did an Etch-a-Sketch and just didn't? I know that's crazy, but you asked for my manifesto, so that's the top of the one right there. And then the other would be just to, like, get rid of all all fiscal year deadlines for all, because work happens at the speed of trust, and that does not happen in a 12-month fiscal year.
Liaison or Abdiel?
I think I also struggle with the idea of manifesto, because so much of what I think I want not just for artists and culture workers. So I guess, you know, it's really trite to say, but I do want portable benefits. I do want to imagine a future where we can appropriately talk about a citizen share and a citizen's dividend. And I think that that has to absolutely include a conversation about reparations. And I think that we need to actually have healthcare. I think it's shameful that, you know, we have some of the poorest health outcomes while having one of the most expensive healthcare systems competitively of industrialized nations. I want those things for all of us, though. Like, and I know that artists will enrich and benefit and be benefited by, because they won't have to make these, again, scarcity choices between the job that gives them benefits and stable income and what they know that with the right kind of support and help and work, they could even make into a viable business model. If we weren't sort of thinking about the way that we push people into sort of career paths that are sort of not healthy for them, I guess. So, I mean, I think most of the things I want for all of us rather than just kind of artists and cultural workers. So from that point of view, it doesn't really feel like a manifesto, but I think definitely I would like us to sort of break away from the very ideals of sort of the trickle-down support, trickle-down economic support that seems to be like super pernicious in the way that we incentivize artists. So I would just say that if that's my one pillar.
I like the idea of thinking of abundance and unfettering, and therefore unfettering a lot of our impact, maybe. I'm still thinking through that question. And I think a lot about how we're showing up for these alternative economy trailblazers and what that means for us and the larger impact that it has on the arts and culture sphere. We're thinking of it as, or we're trying to support these conditions that begat Tulsa, Oklahoma, Oakland, California as a Harlem of the West, right? And these examples are marked by financial independence through local ownership. And so I think it just goes back again to Jen's point about art doesn't happen because I was funded, right? Art just happens when you have abundance, when you have sustainability, when you live in a regenerative economy. And I think those examples of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Oakland, California prove that. So what does it look like if we are financially independent, financially self-determining? What are the possibilities? And for me, I'm also enamored by the idea of possibilities and what is possible already with the leadership that is happening on the ground. But what's that missing link to then amplify that?
Great, thank you. David, do you think we can squeeze in one more, or do you want to wrap up? One more? Okay. So this last question, does technology and the shift to digital present real solutions to artists and arts and culture organizations whose resources have been severely disrupted by the pandemic? Another hard one, I know.
So I definitely think that there's opportunities around technology, but technology is inherently a part of the same dynamics of the same economy that we've been talking about. And so when we think about how unequal access is in terms of digital inclusion, both in urban and rural areas, it's not a complete solution. When we think about the fact that if you look at already some of the arts that have already moved into the online space, whether it's musicians and others having to deal with like the major platforms and whether or not there's real monetization and equity to be found in those platforms, I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from journalism, from music, from others that have already sort of entered those platform spaces to really think about how, in some cases, nonprofits and other cultural workers who haven't been in those spaces now can get on those spaces, but should appropriately think about the economic model right up top. Or otherwise you sort of face that same sort of precarity model just moved online. I think that there's huge opportunities in how this sort of can afford more accessible spaces in terms of disability justice and access rights. But it all for me comes down to the idea of most of us do not own these platforms. They are great. But unless we're also thinking about data and privacy and how, again, that comes back to the human and where do we see the human in all of these kind of conversations, I think we have every possibility of replicating a lot of the harmful practices that are just very present and very evident when we talk about physical spaces and urban planned spaces. That's still the same problems in some of these digital spaces. So that would be my thing. Great opportunities, but I think we still have to grapple with the equity conversation and access conversation at the heart of it.
Wonderful. I'm going to bring us, because we're at time, I want to thank all of our panelists for engaging in this wonderful conversation. Janae, thank you for moderating the questions and answers. And thank you to everyone who played a role in making this happen. Thank you for joining us for ALIS 2021. That wraps us up. We've completed our 4 sessions. We'll be in touch with everyone with follow-up. Thanks again.